Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about Palantir COO Shyam Sankar having an interview with Richard Barlow on Yahoo Finance. We're going to analyze the video and we're going to talk about ultimately what they discussed in that video because both of them said some pretty interesting things. Now, WEJO is one of the Palantir SPAC investments one of Palantir's 14 investments that they made in other companies. So Palantir has an equity stake in WEJO. Additionally, Palantir offers products with WEJO. It's one of the SPACs they work the most intimately with because WEJO is one of the leading car connected vehicle data companies in the world, which means they manage, process, and really understand how to transform data for car companies and do that at a rate of like 70 billion miles of footage every month. Like, it is actually insane the amount of data they process. They are building their entire platform on top of Palantir Foundry. So they have a very intimate and close connection. The CEO knows them very well. And in this interview, Shyam Sankar said some really interesting things about AWS and Foundry and about the partnership with WEJO writ large. So we're going to get into it. Quick thing before we get into it, you might be noticing this like thing in my forehead. I don't know how I got these like pimples that broke out. It's probably going to be here for the next couple of videos. I never break out, like I never get pimples, but for some reason, I guess it happened. I don't know. Is that growing older? Is that a stress thing? I have no idea. But yeah, for the next couple of videos, you're going to see some pimples in the middle of my eyebrows. All right, let's get into it.
Palantir and the mobility data firm WEJO are deepening their relationship in the electric vehicle space. Today, WEJO unveiled the availability of the electric vehicle infrastructure operating system through the Palantir Foundry. And here to discuss this latest iteration of the partnership between these two companies is Richard Barlow, CEO of WEJO, and Shyam Sankar, Chief Operating Officer of Palantir. Yahoo Finance's own Prosty Romanian is also stopping by for this discussion. Thank you all for being here. Richard, I'll start with you on this. Tell us who you're targeting to have use this EV infrastructure operating system and what kinds of problems this could actually solve.
So we're targeting network operators, we're targeting retailers, utilities providers, and energy companies, and a whole host of other organizations, including government, who need to understand where to install EV infrastructure. In 2019, 29% of all CO2 emissions came from vehicles, and EVs are now being introduced, not as fast as they should be, to reduce those emissions. We've now built with Palantir an operating system where a whole suite of agencies, of network operators and utility providers can now establish exactly where to install infrastructure.
So this is some really interesting stuff. I covered this video a while back ago when they released the first blog post about the product. But WEJO's Richard Barlow is talking about WEJO's Richard Barlow. Yes, I was about to say Richard WEJO's Barlow. This is why I got pimples. This is like I'm toughening up my words. WEJO is basically saying, look, electric vehicle charging stations are going to need a lot of operating system in order to conduct themselves. Meaning, if you have 50 cars overnight that are getting charged at an electric vehicle charging station, there's an electric grid, which means there's network operators, municipalities, towns, all these different connectors that ultimately have to be able to come together to be able to provide that electricity to those cars. Well, it only takes like 30 minutes or an hour to charge a car at max. So once that's over, how do you transfer the data or the electricity that's being gained from the grid in order to put it into other sources and into other stations that could also use that electric energy in a meaningful way? That is one example of tons of more examples that exist for how a city, a station, an entire township, an entire state can actually implement this type of software built on top of Palantir Foundry in all the electric vehicle charging stations that are going to exist. It's not just enough to have a charging station, hook up some chargers, and assume everything's okay. There are millions of data points that go into making sure that an electric car can come, get a charge on time so that there's an incentive to actually get an electric car, because if you can't use the car, there's no incentive to use it, which is one of the biggest reasons people still buy gas cars, because they're like, they can rely on gas, but they can't rely on charging stations, and then be able to safely secure enough energy in the most clean way so that that energy can then be utilized in other ways. So the mobile transporters have a meaningful destination to go to and a seamless experience. And network operators can guarantee that electric vehicles that are going to get charged are not going to overburden their entire electric grid. Because if you're charging, what gas stations are getting 100 cars an hour. If in the next 10 years electric vehicle stations are charging 100, 200 cars an hour, that's electricity coming from the grid of a certain city that's not going to other stuff, right? Because when electricity is going from something, it's not going to something else. There's a lot of data management that is involved in making sure that operation is seamless. And that's one of the most amazing things WEJO is doing, in addition to a lot of other product offerings they have. And this partnership with Foundry and Palantir is basically about creating this operating system that all electric vehicle charging stations in the world could potentially one day.
Shyam, this is Pras here. What exactly is the data problem that exists with EV charging and infrastructure, and how does Palantir's Foundry product help with that?
Well, thank you for having me. So that's a great question. You're dealing with enormous multi-trillion scale data sets that depict where the demand for EV charging is not only today, but where is it going to be in the future based on the empirical real world usage of vehicles out there. Plus you have the incredible infrastructure overlay. Like where can I even put infrastructure based on the grid, based on the dynamics? What will the cost of it be? How do you really pioneer the intersection of those things? One of which is corporate proprietary data with, WEJO's unique data asset on the vehicles to drive this sort of decision making.
So Richard, I'm curious how this product and this combination, this OS, if you will, can actually alleviate this deep problem that we have in this country with the lack of charge plugs across a number of localities and states.
Well, one of the things we want to break is this myth around range anxiety. There's this view that EVs at the moment don't have enough kilowatts. That's not true. We understand we've collected over 13.2 trillion data points. We've collected over 500 billion miles of data from vehicles driving around, including over 300,000 EVs. We know how vehicles are being driven day in, day out. And the typical journeys are sub 50 miles per day per vehicle. So there doesn't need to be a fundamental change of fuel companies with hundreds of charging points on site. What there needs to be is a more intelligent approach. So, for example, with our OS, we can now work with energy companies, we can work with consumers of vehicles so that if they plug the vehicle in overnight, not all vehicles at the same time in the same area are charging at the same time. That put a huge pressure on the infrastructure, on the grid. Whereas actually, by having a live OS, we can say 10 p.m. to 11 p.m., this group of vehicles are charging. 11 p.m. to 1 a.m., this group of vehicles. And then there's enough charge on all the vehicles for them then to do the day's journey required, the following day's journeys required, rather than unnecessarily filling up a vehicle's complete battery life.
So that's basically what I was talking about a little bit above before, and I watched Richard talk about it a while back, so that's why it kind of made sense to me, and that's why he's reiterating this point. But that's pretty amazing. I mean, 13 trillion data points, 500 billion miles of data collected, over 300,000 electric vehicles. And when you talk about a company that's data-driven, this is why Palantir invested in WEJO. They have the capacity to be able to analyze these things at scale, collect this data at scale, and then make intelligent decisions based upon this data. This is the whole nature of why data drives the world right now and why data is the new oil. So with this type of data, Richard is saying, well, look, people have this range anxiety. They don't want to buy electric cars. They don't want to use electric vehicles because they think they're not going to be able to drive enough miles in it. He's like, but the average electric vehicle, after analyzing 300,000 of them, only drives about 50 miles a day, which is on par for like most cars in general. So it's like, if you're only driving 50 miles a day, just to and from here and there, then you don't really need this like new car that does 700 miles or something. You just need an operating system that is able to let you know that you shouldn't have anxiety because you have all these different points in which you can get electric charging, but also eases the burden on the grid when you're trying to get more charging if you're not doing 50 miles a day. So he's saying it's not a question of cars. It's not a question of making more charging stations. It's a question of having operating systems that are able to work intelligently with all these charging stations so that they can actually provide data-driven decisions to customers and to merchants to be able to make sure that electric vehicles are sustainable for the long term. And this is so vital because we all agree, I would assume if you're watching this, you probably agree that electric vehicles are taking over. Like, it's just inevitable. Electric vehicles are going to take over. And we will not have gas cars in the next 20, 30 years. It's just an inevitable reality. Ford, GM, all the biggest car manufacturers are changing to electric vehicles. If that's the case, there has to be intelligent software at the forefront powering that transformation. And that's why I think Palantir invested in WEJO, and that's why I think they're working really intimately with these guys to see what type of software they could cook up with them.
Shyam, from a partnership like this, for Palantir, what kind of revenue opportunity could that even create in the future?
Well, what we love about working with Richard and the team at WEJO is just their ambition, the speed at which they've been able to move by building applications on top of Foundry. They announced Neural Edge, which is cutting edge AI technology that leverages what we've built together to run on every potential car out there last month. Just this month, you now see this entirely new product being birthed. We think that the revenue opportunity here is quite large. What AWS was to developers last decade, Foundry really will be to developers this decade.
I think Shyam at the end, he just like slid that in there because the question was not about AWS. The question was not about Amazon. The question was about how much money are you gonna make with WEJO? And he's like, bro, we're gonna make a lot of money with WEJO because what WEJO's doing and our partnership with them is going to be the next frontier of data just in mobility. We're not even talking about all the other verticals that Palantir can operate in. So the core breakdown of this statement is very obvious. AWS became a platform for developers to build on top of. I have a startup. We're building our startup on top of AWS. AWS is a cloud computing system. There's hundreds of microservices within AWS. Developers love AWS because they know how to work with it. It's been normalized for the past 14 years. It makes a lot of sense. It's one of the most easiest things to get set up on. What Shyam is saying is that the managing and interpreting of data using AI and machine learning to make intelligent decisions, which is not necessarily what AWS does. AWS is a cloud computing platform, essentially S3, which stores all of your files, like your photos, your videos, your audio, all that stuff, the pictures. That stuff is what made the majority of AWS's revenue really run, right? Because when AWS was able to say, hey, all the stuff you're paying engineers to figure out how to save in terms of the data, we could just put in this thing called S3 and it's just on AWS, and you could pay us like 10 cents a month to save like 10 million photos, which is literally like, it's actually crazy how cheap it is because it's just, at the end of the day, they're just JPEGs, right, in a server. Then that simplified a lot of things for organizations. So AWS was the first iteration of cloud computing, and they were the pioneers in the cloud. They were a platform for developers to build off of. Foundry is the interpretation of that data that is in the cloud in order to make intelligent decisions, and business intelligence is increasing at the speed of light. I just did a podcast with a former IBM employee. I would highly recommend you guys watch that. And his entire argument was that there will be companies that execute on AI and intelligence, and there will be companies that don't. And the ones that don't will die, just like the companies that didn't transition to going online eventually died. So what Shyam is saying, or what he's predicting, is that Foundry for this next decade will be the operating system that developers build on top of to manage, interpret, and understand their data, just like AWS was the platform for developers to build software applications on top of when it came to hosting and managing their data in the cloud, which is really, really exciting stuff to see if they can actually execute that.
Hey, Shyam, quick follow-up here. Do you think that this product is actually more for governments than it is for private enterprise like OEMs and charge companies, because of the fact that there's such a huge opportunity to use public land? Here in New York, they're gonna open a huge space in Brooklyn just for public charging for a lot of people to use their EVs there. So what do you think about that? Is that what the opportunity is?
I think it's going to be multi-stakeholder and really at the intersection. Richard talked about utilities. That's an obvious and big one, and it's really kind of their primary charge. But large corporations, energy companies who are transitioning from oil and gas to renewables have a big play to make here. A lot of their gasoline infrastructure, gas station infrastructure needs a new purpose. And at the intersection of that will be public lands, public funding, the equitable priorities that governments have in order to make sure this infrastructure is available to all.
Well, that's the last thing I wanted to talk about, right? There's going to be multi-stakeholders in this operation. There's going to be governments that need to use this. There's going to be electric gas stations that need to go electric that are going to change this. There are going to be car companies that obviously are going to need to use this. So there's so many different use cases for this combination with Palantir and WEJO that it really just makes an exciting time to think about what electric vehicle charging infrastructure could be like if the world is going electric, which we know it is, and if Palantir and WEJO have one of the best software applications for the world to be able to use. They won't be the only ones, but if they can be the best ones and they can start while it's in its infancy right now, then there's a really, really good opportunity for them to scale long term. So overall, those are my thoughts. Palantir and WEJO charging up for electric car vehicle charging infrastructure. Shyam Sankar believing that Foundry can be the next decade's version of AWS. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Looking forward to reading them. My name is Amit. I'll see you guys in the next one.